She heard every secret. She let them think she was nothing. Then she destroyed them all. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. If you're still watching at the end, hit that like button and let me know. Every single comment means the world. Now settle in, because what this woman did in silence is more powerful than anything you'll hear today. The day Evelyn Cross arrived at the Mercer Ranch, the sky was the color of a bruise. Not the soft purple kind that fades by morning, the deep, ugly yellow-green kind that sits heavy over flat land and tells every creature with good sense to find cover and stay there. Storm weather. The kind that rolls in slow off the high desert, gathering everything loose and worthless in its path, and doesn't apologize for what it leaves behind. She came in the back of a buckboard wagon, sitting straight as a fence post with a single canvas bag balanced across her knees. No hat, no gloves, despite the cutting October wind. Her dark hair was pinned back so severely it looked almost punishing, and her face, angular, pale, almost aggressively plain, gave nothing away. Not fear, not hope, not even the cautious, sideways nervousness most women showed when arriving somewhere entirely new and entirely uncertain. Just stillness. Remarkable, unsettling stillness. The man driving the wagon was named Gerald Pratt. He was a broker of a particular kind, the kind that dealt in human arrangements nobody wanted to call what they actually were. He matched workers to ranches, servants to households, laborers to whoever would pay his finder's fee without asking too many questions about the people being delivered. He was thick through the middle, red-faced from drink and weather in equal measure, and he had small calculating eyes set too close together that were always moving, always measuring, always looking for the angle. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the dirt yard between the main house and the long, low bunkhouse and called out in a voice designed to carry, "Mercer, got your housekeeper." The ranch hands who were mending fence near the water trough stopped their work. 3 of them. They leaned on their posts and watched with the particular lazy cruelty of bored men who had nothing better to do. Silas Mercer came out of the barn. He was a big man, not in the ostentatious, puffed-up way of men who want you to notice their size, but in the functional, quietly dangerous way of someone built by actual labor. Broad shoulders that strained the seams of a flannel shirt worn thin at the elbows. Hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same red cedar he used to build his fence posts. 42 years old, though he looked both older and younger depending on the light. Older in the lines carved around his eyes. Younger in the stubborn set of his jaw that hadn't yet learned to accept defeat, even though defeat had been circling him like a patient wolf for the better part of 2 years. He walked up to the wagon and looked at Evelyn Cross the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he isn't sure is going to hold up. "This her?" he said to Pratt. Not to Evelyn, to Pratt, as though she weren't sitting 3 feet away. "That's her," Pratt said cheerfully. "Evelyn Cross. Good worker, clean, reliable. One thing you need to know?" He lowered his voice, though not by much. "She's deaf. Completely. Can't hear a word you say. Use hand signals, write things down. She reads fine, picks things up quick once she knows what you want. Honestly, Mercer, it works in your favor. Quiet as a church mouse, won't bother anybody, won't gossip with the hands." "I don't need a deaf housekeeper," Silas said flatly. "I need someone who can take instructions." "She takes instructions fine. Write 'em down. She's better than 3 women I placed last year who could hear every word and still managed to burn the breakfast and steal the silverware." Pratt was already climbing down from the wagon, already pulling the transaction toward a close the way he always did, moving fast through the part where objections could still matter. "Placement fee's already been settled against your account, like we discussed. She works for room and board, nothing else coming out of your pocket." Silas looked at Evelyn again. Evelyn looked back at him. Her expression did not change. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray. Not soft gray, not stormy gray, but the flat, dense gray of good steel. They held his gaze without aggression, without apology, without any of the anxious scrambling to please that might have made him feel better about the whole arrangement. He looked away first. "Fine," he said, the word coming out like something he was dropping rather than offering. "Rosa will show her where things are. Tell her—" He stopped, made a gesture toward the house. Felt immediately foolish. "Just take her inside." He walked back to the barn. Pratt had the nerve to look pleased with himself. Evelyn heard every word of it. every single syllable. She heard the ranch hands behind her. One of them named Cutter, she'd learn, a lanky, leather-faced man with a mouth like a knife wound, mutter to the one beside him, "Deaf mute, Lord have mercy. Boss must really be scraping the barrel." She heard the other one laugh. She heard the precise shape of their contempt, the easy comfort of it, the way they settled into dismissiveness, the way men settle into a familiar chair. She picked up her canvas bag and followed the path toward the house. There were things Evelyn Cross was and things she was not. She was not, in any medical sense, deaf. Her hearing was, in fact, exceptionally acute, sharper than most, the kind of hearing that had always made crowded rooms feel assaultive and quiet rooms feel like gifts. She could hear a whispered conversation through a closed door, the turn of a key in a lock 3 rooms away, the change in a person's breathing that signaled they were about to lie. What she was a woman who had learned, slowly, painfully, and through the kind of education that leaves marks, that people talk more honestly when they believe no one is listening. Her mother had taught her to read lips at age 7, not because either of them was deaf, but because her mother was a practical woman who believed in tools and believed that understanding the gap between what people said aloud and what they said when they thought themselves unheard was the most important tool a woman with no money and no powerful name could possibly possess. Her father had taught her silence, not intentionally. He'd taught her by dying young and leaving them with nothing, and she'd learned that in the absence of everything else, silence was the one thing that cost nothing and occasionally saved everything. She was 31 years old. She'd worked as a legal secretary in Denver for 6 years before the firm dissolved. She'd worked as a bookkeeper in Cheyenne before the man who owned the books decided her competence was a personal affront and replaced her with his nephew. She'd spent 3 months helping her cousin in Santa Fe before the money ran out. She'd answered Gerald Pratt's placement advertisement with the particular desperation of someone who was not yet desperate enough to stop being careful. And she'd made her arrangement with him very clear. She would play the role, he would place her, and they would split the finder's fee. Pratt had looked at her like she was slightly insane and agreed immediately, which told her everything she needed to know about what kind of man he was. She stepped through the front door of the Mercer Ranch main house and stood very still for a moment just inside the threshold. The house was failing, not collapsing, not abandoned, failing in the quiet, grinding way that things fail when someone is fighting hard to keep them upright, but doesn't have quite enough to hold against the weight. The floors were clean, but the boards were warping. The kitchen was organized, but the organization had the frantic, improvised quality of someone barely maintaining. There was a smell of old grease and something chemical. A cleaning agent applied too aggressively to a surface that needed replacement, not scrubbing. 2 previous housekeepers had clearly been through. She could see their marks in the half-finished attempts, the abandoned systems, the kitchen pantry where someone had started labeling shelves and given up after the first 4. A Mexican woman named Rosa came in from the back hallway, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked at Evelyn with the same frank, measuring look Silas had used, except Rosa's had something more in it, a weariness, and beneath the weariness, a flicker of something careful and watchful. Rosa held up one finger, disappeared, and came back with a small chalkboard and a piece of chalk. She wrote, "I am Rosa. I cook. You clean and manage. Do you understand?" Evelyn took the chalk and wrote back, "Yes, I understand. Thank you for explaining." Rosa looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, very slowly, and went back to the stove. It was, Evelyn thought, the most honest interaction she'd had in 3 weeks. The first 2 days, she moved through the house like water, finding the path of least resistance, filling in where things were missing, staying completely out of the way of everything loud and obvious. She fixed the warped board in the hallway by shimming it from beneath with wood she found in the small barn attached to the house. She organized the kitchen pantry using a system her legal secretary brain recognized immediately, categorized by use frequency, labeled in both English and Spanish because Rosa's English was impeccable, but her preference was clearly Spanish and efficiency was efficiency. She scrubbed the cast iron pots that someone had left to rust in the back corner and brought them back to usefulness with salt and fat and patience. She did not look at anyone directly. She did not appear to react to anything said in her presence. And in those first 48 hours, people talked around her the way they talked around furniture. The ranch hands, Cutter, a younger one named Pete, who couldn't have been more than 20 and had the particular anxious energy of someone trying to prove himself, and an older, thicker man called Dutch, who said almost nothing but watched everything, came through the kitchen at mealtimes and spoke freely. What they said was, at first, the ordinary language of men who worked hard and were tired. Water in the east pasture troughs low again. Fence line near the creek needs another post before the rains hit. Boss has been up in the study again half the night, third night running. That last one came from Pete, who said it quietly to Cutter while she was wiping down the table not 3 feet from them. Cutter glanced at her, the glance of someone checking that a lamp isn't going to suddenly talk, and then looked back at his coffee. "None of our business," he said. "Man's got his troubles. What kind of troubles keeps you up 3 nights?" "The kind with numbers in 'em," Dutch said from the end of the table without looking up from his plate. Evelyn kept wiping the table. Her handwriting inside her head was already beginning to organize what she was gathering into neat columns. On the 3rd day, she found the study. Not found it in the sense of discovering its location, she'd mapped the entire house in the first hour. Found it in the sense of finding its contents, because the door had been closed until that morning, and when she came upstairs with clean linens for the guest room, she discovered it standing slightly open and Silas Mercer gone to check the eastern fence line with Dutch. She stood outside the door for exactly 4 seconds. Then she pushed it open and went inside. She was not a snoop by temperament. She had in fact a strong personal code about privacy and its importance. But she was also a woman who had spent 6 years in a legal office reading documents that crossed her desk, and she recognized the shape of danger in paperwork the way other people recognized it in weather. The desk was covered in papers. She did not touch anything. She stood at the edge and read. It took her 11 minutes. At the end of 11 minutes, she knew 3 things with absolute certainty. First, Silas Mercer owed a significant amount of money to a lending institution called the Western Continental Land and Development Company, a name that sounded respectable and institutional and was almost certainly neither. Second, the debt was structured in a way that was not, strictly speaking, standard. There were clauses buried in the language of the original loan agreement that created conditions for accelerated foreclosure, conditions that could be triggered by a third party without Silas's direct knowledge or agreement. The kind of clauses that shouldn't have been in a standard agricultural lending agreement, the kind that got put in by lawyers who were not working for the borrower. Third, someone had already triggered those clauses. There was a letter dated 11 days ago from a man named Harlan Doyle describing himself as the regional representative of Western Continental, informing Silas that due to material changes in the assessed value of the collateral property, the ranch itself, his loan was being called to immediate settlement within 60 days. 60 days, dated 11 days ago. She stood very still in the middle of the study. Then she very carefully noted every detail she had seen, the document numbers, the company name, the date, the name Harlan Doyle. In the precise organized compartments of her memory that her legal training had built and her mother's practicality had furnished. She walked out of the study. She pulled the door to exactly the position she had found it. She went back to making the beds. That evening, Silas came in from the field with the particular exhausted anger of a man who has been fighting something all day and is not winning. He dropped his hat on the hook by the door, dropped himself into the chair at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall while Rosa set food in front of him. Evelyn was at the counter, working on the week's supply inventory, her back to the room. Silas picked up his fork, put it down, picked up the glass of water Rosa had poured, stared at it. "Rosa," he said very quietly, "you know what Western Continental is?" Rosa at the stove didn't turn around. The set of her shoulders changed in a very small way. "I've heard the name." "What have you heard?" A pause. "I've heard it's not a good name to hear." Silas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Yeah, that's about where I've landed too." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Pratt knew. When he set up that loan, he had to have known what he was getting me into. The man sets up arrangements for a living. You don't walk into something like this on accident." Rosa said nothing. "I should have had a lawyer look at it before I signed," Silas continued, and the self-recrimination in his voice had the worn, grooved quality of a thought revisited many times. "I know that. I knew it then. But Holt was breathing down my neck about the water rights, and I needed cash fast, and Pratt said he had a connection, and I was..." He stopped. I was stupid. And now Doyle's got me in a box. There must be something, Rosa began. The terms are airtight, Silas said. I had Henderson's boy from town look at them. He's not much of a lawyer, but he knows enough. He said the foreclosure clause is ironclad. 60 days, or I hand over the deed. Evelyn's pen continued moving across the inventory sheet. Western Continental, Harlan Doyle, Pratt, Water Rights, Holt. She added, Henderson's boy. Insufficient legal review. Look deeper. That night, lying in the small room off the kitchen that had been designated as hers, she did not sleep for some time. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought with the organized, unsentimentally focused attention that had always been her greatest asset and, occasionally, her greatest loneliness. Gerald Pratt had delivered her to this ranch knowing about the loan arrangement, knowing about Doyle. He described the ranch as a good placement, stable, reliable, a long-term situation. Either he'd lied to her, which was possible, or he'd told her this because from his perspective, it was accurate. The ranch was going to exist in some form for the foreseeable future, just not under Silas Mercer's name, Pratt knew. And Pratt was connected to something she didn't have the full shape of yet. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. She had 49 days. She needed to understand the entire legal architecture of what was being built against this ranch before she could begin to figure out whether any part of it could be torn down. And she needed to do it as a woman who, as far as everyone on this property was concerned, couldn't hear a word being said. Silence, her mother had always said, is not the same as weakness. Silence is a choice. And like every choice, it was most powerful when the person making it knew exactly what they were doing and why. Evelyn Cross knew exactly what she was doing. She closed her eyes and let the sounds of the ranch settle over her. The distant complaint of a horse, the dry creak of the windmill turning in the night wind, the far-off sound of coyotes discussing their evening somewhere past the eastern fence line. And she organized what she knew, what she didn't know, and what she intended to find out. The list of what she didn't know was still long, but it was getting shorter. By the end of her second week, the ranch was different in ways nobody had specifically noticed yet, but everyone had felt. The kitchen ran better. Meals arrived on time, hot, with the kind of reliable consistency that people don't consciously appreciate until they've been without it. The supply inventory was accurate for the first time since the previous winter, according to Rosa, who had expressed this not with words, but with a long evaluating look at the organized pantry and a single slow nod of her head that Evelyn had understood as precisely as a speech. The study had been dusted and organized. She'd gotten permission via the chalkboard, phrasing it as needing to clean the whole second floor for the first time. She'd been careful. She'd touched nothing important. She'd read everything. She knew considerably more now. Western Continental Land and Development Company was not a bank. It was a private lending entity incorporated in the state of Nevada with a registered agent named Willard Foss, who appeared, based on the county records she'd gotten Pete to bring her from town, under the pretense of a supply run she'd written out a detailed list for. Pete being the kind of young man who followed written instructions with more care than he followed spoken ones, and who had, in the process of following them, picked up a package from the post office addressed to her that contained 3 pamphlets on Nevada corporate law she'd sent for 10 days prior. Willard Foss was a ghost, but the entity behind him, visible only when you traced the financial connections the way she'd been trained to trace them, connected directly to a name she'd already encountered in Silas's papers, Emmett Holt. The same Holt that Silas had mentioned to Rosa, the man who'd been breathing down his neck about the water rights. Emmett Holt was not a broker or a middleman or a representative. Emmett Holt was, based on everything she could piece together from the documents in the study, the land records Pete had brought without knowing their significance, and a 2-year-old newspaper from the stack of old papers in the hallway that happened to contain a brief notice about a contested water rights dispute in the county. Emmett Holt was the single largest private landowner in a 3-county region, a man who had been systematically expanding his territory for 15 years through methods that were individually legal and collectively something considerably darker. He loaned money through intermediaries. He structured the loans to fail. He acquired the land when they did. He'd done it 11 times in the past decade, based on the property transfer records Evelyn had reconstructed from memory and the county documents. Silas Mercer's ranch was the 12th. And what made the Mercer ranch different from the previous 11? What made it, she was increasingly certain, the one Holt wanted most, was the water. The creek that ran through the eastern boundary of Silas's land was not just a creek. It was the primary natural water source for a stretch of high desert that encompassed more than 40,000 acres to the north and east. Whoever controlled the water rights to that creek controlled effectively the grazing viability of the entire region. Emmett Holt wanted to own the desert. To do that, he needed the water. To get the water, he needed the ranch. To get the ranch, he had built a legal trap elegant enough to look like misfortune. Evelyn lay in her small room and listened to the windmill turn and thought about water and law and the particular kind of evil that wears patience like a suit. Then she picked up her pen and her notebook and began to write. She wrote for 3 hours. When she was finished, she had the beginning of a plan. It wasn't complete yet. It couldn't be. There were pieces she didn't have, angles she couldn't see, legal questions that needed actual legal expertise to answer. But the shape of it was there. The question was not whether Emmett Holt could be stopped. The question was whether she could stop him before anyone realized she was the one doing it. Silence, she thought, writing the last line of her notes by the light of the single lamp in her room. Silence and patience. And 47 days. She folded the notebook closed and set it beneath the loose board under her bed. The same loose board she'd fixed in the hallway, because the first thing you do in a house you intend to understand is learn which floors move and which ones hold. And she blew out the lamp. Outside, the windmill turned, and the ranch slept, unaware that the most dangerous person on its property was lying in the smallest room in the house, not making a sound. The notebook under the loose board grew heavier with each passing day. Not in weight. The pages were thin, the pencil marks economical, the handwriting small and precise, the way a woman writes when she has learned that paper and privacy are both finite resources. But heavy in the way that accumulated knowledge becomes heavy when the person carrying it cannot yet put it down or share it with anyone. Evelyn added to it every night, sometimes for an hour, sometimes until the lamp oil ran low and she was writing in near darkness by instinct and memory alone. She cataloged names, dates, document numbers, overheard fragments, the particular silences that followed certain words in certain conversations, because silence, she had learned long ago, was its own kind of language, and often more honest than anything said aloud. 43 days remaining. She counted them the way a person counts the distance to dry land when they are already swimming. The rhythm of the ranch had begun to accommodate her in the unconscious way that living things accommodate whatever is consistently present. The hands no longer tracked her movement through a room with the pointed, slightly cruel awareness of men watching something that doesn't belong. She had become, as she had intended, part of the furniture, or reliable, present, essentially invisible. Cutter occasionally remembered to look at her with mild contempt when he was showing off for Pete, but the effort of it was clearly fading. Dutch had stopped looking at her altogether, which she recognized as a form of acceptance from a man who saved his attention for things that concerned him. Rosa was a different matter entirely. Rosa watched her with the careful, patient attention of a woman who has spent a long life sorting people into categories and is not yet sure which category Evelyn belongs in. She never said anything directly. They communicated almost entirely through the chalkboard, through gesture, through the shorthand that develops between two people who work in close quarters and are both too practical to waste energy on friction. But sometimes, in the kitchen in the early morning before anyone else was awake, Rosa would set a second cup of coffee on the counter near Evelyn without being asked, and there was something in the gesture that was warmer than efficiency. Evelyn accepted the coffee and did not betray by any change in her expression how much the small kindness meant. She had work to do. The first piece of work was understanding the exact legal mechanism of the foreclosure trap, which meant understanding the loan documents in their entirety. Not just the summary she'd assembled from memory on her first pass through the study, but every clause, every subordinate provision, every piece of embedded language that had been designed to look like standard boilerplate while functioning as something considerably more calculated. To do that without access to the documents themselves required her to do something she had not done in her first 2 weeks at the ranch: request a supply run into town that required overnight absence. She wrote the request on the chalkboard carefully. Supply shortage. Pantry items needed before winter stores run low. Rosa agrees the list is substantial. Request permission to travel to Caldwell with Pete on Friday's regular run, return Saturday. She held the board up for Silas in the barn doorway, where he was working on a broken harness with the focused, economical movements of a man who has repaired the same harness too many times. He read it, looked at her, looked back at it. Rosa vouches for the list, he said, not to her, to the air beside her, in the habitual, slightly uncomfortable way he'd developed of addressing her without quite addressing her. She pointed to Rosa, agrees on the board, and nodded once. He handed it back to her. Fine. Be back by midday Saturday. What he did not know, and what Pete also did not know, was that Evelyn had no intention of spending Friday evening at the boarding house where the ranch hands stayed on overnight supply runs. While Pete was at the saloon spending his incidental money with the cheerful predictability of a 20-year-old with nothing to save for, Evelyn Cross would be in the law office of a man named Arthur Giddings, who practiced alone on the second floor of the dry goods building on Caldwell's Main Street, and who had, in the previous week, received a letter from a woman describing herself as conducting research for a family estate matter and asking if he would be available for a consultation Friday evening regarding Nevada corporate law and the enforceability of certain private lending agreements. Giddings had written back. Evelyn had retrieved his reply herself from the post office, slipping it into her coat pocket during the supply run she'd orchestrated the previous week without Pete noticing, which had required approximately no effort because Pete's attention was entirely occupied by the dry goods merchant's daughter, who was 17 and had red hair and represented, from Pete's perspective, the entire point of supply runs. Giddings' letter was 4 sentences. He was available Friday evening. His rate was $2 for an hour. He asked that she bring any relevant documents if she had them. She didn't have the documents. She had something better. She had 6 years of legal secretary work, a precise and retentive memory, and 47 days of careful study. She would bring what she had. She would see what Giddings could do with it. The wagon ride into Caldwell took 3 hours on a road that had been adequate once and was now losing its argument with the landscape. Pete drove and talked in the cheerful, stream-of-consciousness way of young men who hadn't yet developed the habit of filtering their thoughts before they became words, which meant Evelyn spent 3 hours learning more about Pete Alderman than she had strictly needed to know. His mother was in Kansas, his father had gone to California and not come back. He'd been working ranches since he was 15. He thought Dutch was the best cowhand in the county, even though Dutch never said anything nice to anybody, and he thought Silas Mercer was a fair man who had gotten a bad hand dealt to him and didn't deserve what was happening. Whatever's happening, Pete added, with the philosophical uncertainty of someone who had absorbed the tension of the last month without understanding its source. Something's wrong, though. You can feel it, like before a bad storm. You know how it gets quiet in a particular way? That's how the boss has been. He glanced at her, remembered she couldn't hear him, and looked back at the road. She looked at the flat, dry land moving past them and thought about the particular loneliness of sitting 3 feet from someone who is talking about exactly what concerns you, being unable to respond and choosing not to. Arthur Giddings was a small man in his late 50s who had the dusty, compressed look of someone who had spent 30 years in small rooms with large problems. His office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. He had a good handshake, which told her something, and he looked at her directly rather than slightly to her left or right, which told her more. You mentioned Nevada corporate structure, he said, settling behind his desk and pulling a notepad forward. That's an unusual focus for an estate matter. The estate involves interests in a Nevada-registered entity, she said, and watched his eyes adjust fractionally to the information that she could speak, which she had not mentioned in her letter. He adjusted smoothly. What's the name of the entity? Western Continental Land and Development Company. Registered in Nevada? Registered agent named Willard Foss, operated as a private lending vehicle. She paused. Does the name mean anything to you? Something moved behind Giddings' eyes, very small, very controlled. Where did you come across it? Research, she said. Does it mean something to you? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, There have been some property transfers in this county over the past several years that involved Western Continental as the originating lender. The transfers were all legal, on their face. There was never a formal complaint filed. Another pause. People here know the name Emmett Holt, Miss Cross, she said. Miss Cross. People know the name. They also know what happens when you put that name in a document and try to take it to someone official. He looked at her steadily. What is your actual interest in this? She looked back at him for exactly 4 seconds. Then she made a decision that was not, strictly speaking, part of her plan, because plans are made in small rooms at night and reality requires adjustment. I work at a ranch that is currently under foreclosure pressure from Western Continental, she said. The loan documents contain clauses that I believe were fraudulently structured. The rancher does not have legal representation adequate to the problem. I'm trying to understand whether the structure of the foreclosure can be legally challenged, and if so, what the basis of that challenge would be. Giddings looked at her for a long moment. You work at a ranch? Yes. As what? Housekeeper. He was quiet for another moment. Miss Cross, he said finally, what did you do before you were a housekeeper? I was a legal secretary, she said, for 6 years, in Denver. Something changed in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the particular look of a man who has just understood why a conversation that seems strange has actually been making perfect sense. Write down what you remember of the loan structure, he said, sliding the notepad across to her. Every clause you can recall? I'll tell you what I think. She wrote for 20 minutes. When she slid the notepad back to him, he read it without speaking. His eyebrows rose once, early on, and then settled into a flat, focused line that did not move again until he reached the last page. Then he set it down and looked at her. This acceleration clause, he said, tapping the page. If this is worded the way you've described it, it's not valid under territorial law. The 1887 agricultural lending provisions require that any acceleration clause in a secured agricultural loan must include a 60-day cure period before foreclosure proceedings can be initiated. A 60-day notice period is not the same thing as a cure period. If the documents don't include explicit language granting the borrower the right to cure the default within the 60 days, the clause is structurally defective. Evelyn's hand, resting on the edge of his desk, stayed completely still. The documents use the word notice, she said, not cure. You're certain? I read them twice. The word cure does not appear in the acceleration clause. Giddings looked at her for another moment, then looked down at the notepad again. If that's accurate, he said slowly, then the entire foreclosure process, as they've structured it, is built on a defective foundation. A competent challenge filed before the foreclosure is formally initiated, before they file with the county clerk, would, at minimum, force them to restart the process under legally correct terms. That buys significant time. And if the challenge also raises the question of fraudulent inducement in the original loan arrangement, he stopped. Do you have evidence of fraudulent inducement? I have a pattern, she said. 11 previous property acquisitions through the same mechanism in 3 counties over 10 years. Same lender. Same structural defects in the loan agreements. Different names on the paperwork, but if you trace the ownership, they all connect to Holt, Giddings said. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the street sounds of Caldwell's Friday evening filtered through the single window. Boots on a boardwalk, a door opening and closing at the saloon, a horse shifting its weight at the hitching post. You've been doing this from inside the ranch, Giddings said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Without the rancher knowing. Yes. Why? She considered how much of the truth to offer him, because I needed to understand the full shape of what was being done before I said anything to anyone. You can't fight something you don't fully see. He nodded slowly. The nod had a quality of recognition in it, the recognition of a man who has spent 30 years trying to explain to people that the law is not a blunt instrument and has rarely been believed. What do you need from me? I need to know the exact statutory language I need to find in the original documents to confirm the defect. And I need to know the correct filing to challenge the foreclosure before it's formally initiated at the county clerk's office. He told her. She did not write it down. She didn't need to. She paid him his $2, shook his hand again, and walked back through the dark Caldwell Street to the boarding house where she had a room reserved under her name. She lay on the bed in her coat for a long time, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, running through everything Giddings had said and mapping it against everything she had already assembled. The defect was real. She was almost certain of it, but almost was not enough. She needed the exact documents, the actual language. And to do that, she needed to get back into the study. She also needed, she was beginning to understand, to make Silas Mercer trust her before she could help him. That was going to be the harder problem. Back at the ranch this following afternoon, she carried the supply crates into the kitchen with Pete and went about the ordinary business of an ordinary Saturday and thought about trust, how it was built, how long it took, and how much she could afford to spend on it with 41 days on the clock. The answer came 3 days later, and it came from an unexpected direction. She was in the barn, finding storage for 2 extra saddle blankets she'd discovered folded behind a cabinet. The kind of domestic archaeology she performed constantly, mapping the ranch's hidden inventory against its actual needs. When she heard Silas come in and not notice her in the dim back corner, he stood in the center of the barn for a moment, and the sound of him standing there had a particular quality, the quality of someone who has just received bad news and has not yet decided what to do with their body in response to it. Then he sat down on the edge of a hay bale and put his face in his hands. He did not make a sound. Evelyn stood in the corner and did not breathe. She had seen grief before, and she had seen fear before, and she recognized this as a specific, suffocating combination of both, the kind that comes when a person looks at the calendar and the numbers and understands, concretely and finally, that the math is not working in their favor. Silas Mercer sat in his own barn in the middle of the afternoon and fell apart in total silence, with the rigid, dignified restraint of a man who would rather break privately than show a crack to anyone who might notice. She should have slipped out. She had fully intended to, but she had misjudged the angle and the boards were dry, and when she shifted her weight, one of them spoke. Silas's head came up. He looked at her. She looked back at him. His face was, there was no other word for it, naked. All the careful, weathered composure stripped away, and underneath it something raw and tired and entirely human. He stared at her for a moment with the particular mortification of a man who has been witnessed in a moment he did not offer for witness. Then something happened that she had not anticipated. He did not look away. He looked at her, and then he looked at his hands, and then he said, not to the air beside her, not to the room in general, but directly to her, in the voice of a man who has simply run out of people to talk to and has decided that a woman who cannot hear is better than no audience at all. I'm going to lose this place. He said it the way confessions are said, quietly and finally, and with the exhaustion of something held too long. 40 years my family worked this land, he continued, still looking at his hands. My father broke himself building it. My mother buried 2 children here and kept going, and I signed my name on a paper I should have had a lawyer look at first, and now some man I've never met who's never set foot on this property is going to take it from me, and there's not a damn thing I can do. His jaw tightened, loosened. And I've got hands depending on me. Rosa, Pete, Dutch. They'd find other work, I know that, but it's not the same as... He stopped. It's not the same. Evelyn stood in the shadow of the back corner with the saddle blankets folded over her arm. And she thought about 6 years in a legal office, learning that the most dangerous documents were always the ones that looked reassuringly standard. And she thought about a woman in Denver who had taught her to read lips because practical knowledge is the only knowledge that holds when everything else falls away. And she thought about a notebook under a loose floorboard with 43 days of work in it. And she made a decision that was not precisely what her plan had called for, but was, she thought, what the moment required. She walked forward out of the shadow. She stopped in front of him. She reached into the pocket of her apron and took out the small notepad she always carried. Not the chalkboard which was in the house, but the personal one, the private one. And she wrote on it and handed it to him. He read it. His expression went through several things in quick succession. What she had written was, Mr. Mercer, the acceleration clause in your loan documents does not include a cure period. Under territorial agricultural lending law, that makes it defective. The foreclosure as structured may not be legally valid. I need to confirm by reading the original documents. I have a contact in Caldwell who practices law. There may be a way to fight this. Please, let me try. Silas looked up from the notepad. He looked at her. He looked back at the notepad. He looked at her again. You can't hear me, he said slowly. She had prepared for this moment in many different ways, on many different nights. She had decided and undecided and redecided how to handle it, what to reveal, what to protect. What she did was take the notepad back, write on it again, and hand it back to him. I understand more than people expect. What matters right now is the loan documents. Do you trust me enough to let me see them? The barn was very quiet. Outside, Dutch was moving horses between the paddocks, and the sound of hooves on dry ground came through the walls in a dull, rhythmic pulse, and the windmill was turning somewhere out to the east, and a crow was arguing with itself in the cottonwood tree near the creek. Silas Mercer looked at the note for a long time. Then he folded it in half, put it in his shirt pocket, and stood up. "Come to the study after supper," he said. "I'll have everything out." He walked out of the barn without looking back. Evelyn stood for a moment in the hay-scented quiet. Then she folded the saddle blankets over the rack where they belonged, smoothed the front of her apron, and walked back toward the house. That evening, after the supper dishes were cleared and Rosa had retired and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, she sat across from Silas Mercer at his desk with the actual documents spread between them. She read them with the particular focused attention that she brought to everything that mattered, moving through each page with her finger and occasionally stopping to make notes in the margin of her personal pad. Silas watched her from the other side of the desk. He had started to say things twice and stopped himself both times, remembering, or half-remembering, and then catching himself in a confusion he clearly found unsettling. She didn't address it. She would deal with the larger truth when the moment came that it was necessary. For now, she needed the documents. The defect was there. It was exactly where Giddings had told her to look. The acceleration clause ran to 3 dense paragraphs and contained the word "notice" 7 times and the word "cure" exactly 0 times. Under the 1887 provisions, the clause was not enforceable as written. Western Continental could not legally foreclose under this document without reforming the contract entirely, which would require Silas's signature, which he could decline to give. But there was more. She found it on page 11 of the original loan agreement, in a subordinate clause buried inside a paragraph about collateral assessment, a paragraph that looked, on first reading, like standard property valuation language, and was, on second reading, something else entirely. The clause granted Western Continental the right to reassess collateral value using representative appraisal standards approved by the lending entity, meaning Holt's own people could assess the property value, using Holt's own standards, and trigger the acceleration based on that assessment. No independent appraisal required. No opportunity for the borrower to dispute. That was not standard. That was a loaded gun aimed directly at the man who'd signed the paper. She wrote, "Found it. 2 separate grounds for challenge. The acceleration clause is defective under territorial law. The appraisal clause gives them unilateral power that violates standard lending protections. We can challenge both. We need to file before Doyle's people move officially. How much time before they do?" Silas read it. His face, which had been set in a controlled, waiting expression throughout her review, shifted slightly. Doyle sent word through Pratt that his men would be here in about 3 weeks to assess the situation. The way he said it communicated everything about what he understood assessed the situation to mean. After that, I expect the formal filing happens fast. 3 weeks. She looked at the calendar on the wall above the desk, looked back at him. She wrote, "Then we have 2 weeks to prepare the challenge. I'll need Giddings and Caldwell to file the legal documents. I'll need you to be willing to sign them, and I need you to trust me for a little longer before I explain everything I have to explain." He read it. He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable and not quite long enough to be a refusal. "You know something you're not telling me," he said. She held his gaze and did not look away. He exhaled through his nose, looked at the documents between them, looked back at her. 2 weeks, he said, and the word had the shape of a man throwing a rope and hoping something catches it. She nodded. Then she gathered the notes she'd made, put them carefully in her apron pocket, and left him alone with his papers. She went to her room, retrieved the notebook from under the loose board, and added everything she had found to the accumulating architecture of what she was building. Then she opened to a fresh page and began drafting the outline of what would need to be filed and in what order and on what basis and by what date. Outside, the windmill turned. 38 days. She worked until midnight and slept for 4 hours and was up before the sun, and the ranch, rising around her in the gray pre-dawn with its sounds and its smells and its particular early morning wait, did not know what was moving inside the stillness it had taken for granted. It never did. The 2 weeks passed the way time passes when every hour inside it carries weight, not slowly, not quickly, but with a particular density that makes each day feel both too long and not long enough. Evelyn moved through them with the same outward stillness she had maintained since the first morning she'd stepped off Gerald Pratt's buckboard wagon, but underneath the stillness, something had shifted. The work she was doing now was not observation. It was construction. And construction, unlike observation, had consequences she could not take back. She made 2 more trips to Caldwell in those 2 weeks, both times with Pete, both times returning with supply crates that contained, tucked inside the lining of her canvas bag, documents from Arthur Giddings, draft filings, statutory references, a carefully worded letter of legal opinion regarding the defective acceleration clause that Giddings had prepared in exchange for a third $2 consultation, and what she suspected was his own personal interest in seeing Emmett Holt face a legitimate challenge in a county court for the first time in 15 years. "You understand," Giddings had said to her on the second visit, setting down his pen and looking at her over the top of his reading glasses, "that if this goes to filing, Holt will know who initiated the challenge. He will respond." "I understand," she said. "He has resources, connections. He's had complaints buried before." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "Do you believe the legal argument is sound?" "I believe it's the strongest challenge to a Western Continental foreclosure I've ever seen assembled," he said, "which is either a very good sign or a very dangerous one, depending on how you look at it." "I look at it as both," she said. "What needs to happen for the filing to be valid?" He told her. She listened with the entirety of her attention, and on the wagon ride back to the ranch, with Pete chattering about the dry goods merchant's red-haired daughter, and the way the October sky was beginning to suggest that winter was no longer a distant theory, she sat with the cold wind in her face and ran through every step of what was coming, testing each joint of the structure for weakness, the way you test a bridge before you trust your full weight to it. On the last night before Doyle's men were expected, she stayed in the study with Silas until past 10 o'clock, which was the latest she had ever remained in a room with him alone, and she went through the filing documents with him point by point on the notepad, explaining each piece and waiting while he read and asked questions in the halting, slightly self-conscious way he had developed of directing his words at her. Not at the air beside her, not at the room, but at her, as though somewhere in the past 2 weeks his brain had quietly abandoned the pretense that she wasn't present in the full sense. He asked good questions. That surprised her and then, on reflection, did not. A man who had built and maintained a working ranch for 20 years without formal education was not a man without intelligence. He simply had his intelligence distributed differently than the men who had the luxury of schooling, applied to problems that were immediate and physical and consequential in ways that law school problems were not. "If we file this and the judge sides with Doyle's people," he said, reading the section about potential outcomes for the 3rd time, "we lose the 60 days and go straight to—" She shook her head and underlined a section of the legal opinion and wrote, "Giddings believes the defect is clear enough that a dismissal is unlikely. The risk is not losing immediately. The risk is delay. They file a counter-argument, and we spend months in procedural back and forth while the ranch needs to operate. That's why we need to file everything at once. Every challenge, every ground, simultaneously. Give them no room to pick us apart piece by piece." He read it, nodded slowly. "You've done this before," he said. She considered the question. "Not exactly this," she wrote, "but close enough." He looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then he looked at her, and the look had something in it she had not seen before. Not the measuring, equipment assessment look of the first day, not the mortified vulnerability of the barn, but something quieter and more complicated. Something that sat in the space between gratitude and the kind of curiosity that hasn't yet decided whether it has the right to ask its own questions. "Evelyn," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. He seemed to notice it at the same moment she did, and the slight awkwardness that followed was of the particular kind that happens when something changes, subtly and irreversibly, in the air between 2 people. "When this is over—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider. "Thank you." She held his gaze for a moment, then she wrote, "Let's win first." He almost smiled. It was close, a shift at the corner of his mouth that didn't quite complete itself. The smile of a man who has forgotten the habit of smiling and is finding his way back to it in the dark. He looked back at the documents and she looked back at her notepad, and they worked until the lamp oil was low and the ranch was entirely silent around them. She went to bed that night with the particular taut alertness of someone who has prepared as thoroughly as preparation allows and knows that tomorrow, preparation ends and the actual thing begins. She slept 4 hours. She was up before anyone. The riders arrived at mid-morning. There were 3 of them, 2 she didn't recognize, large, quiet men of the kind whose primary professional qualification is their size and their willingness to use it, dressed in the neat, expensive way of men funded by someone with money and concern for appearances. The third was Harlan Doyle himself. She recognized him immediately from the description that Dutch had given Pete 3 weeks ago, in the kitchen, in a voice not quite quiet enough. "Big man, reddish hair, going gray, got a way of looking at you like he's already decided the value of everything you own." Dutch had not been wrong. Doyle was perhaps 50, broad through the chest, with a quality of organized authority that she recognized from her years in legal offices as the specific authority of a man who has spent a long time having other people do the unpleasant parts of his work. She was scrubbing this front porch when they rode in. She did not stop scrubbing. Silas came out of the barn at the sound of horses in the yard, and the way he moved, measured, contained, holding himself deliberately still in the way that men hold themselves still when they are actually wound very tight, told her he had not slept much either. "Mercer," Doyle said, without dismounting immediately, doing the thing that powerful men do on horseback, which is remaining elevated a moment longer than necessary. "We appreciate you being here." "It's my ranch," Silas said. "I'm generally here." Doyle dismounted then, and his 2 men did the same, and he walked toward Silas with his hand extended and the smooth, practiced friendliness of a man who has conducted this particular conversation many times and knows every branch of it. "Let's make this easy on everybody. My employer wants a clean resolution. Mr. Holt is prepared to offer fair value for the transfer of the deed, above the outstanding debt amount, a reasonable sum that would let you—" "I know what the offer is," Silas said. "Pratt passed it along. My answer was no." Something moved behind Doyle's eyes, very brief, very controlled. "Mr. Mercer, the legal position is something I'm in the process of discussing with my attorney," Silas said, and Evelyn, on her knees on the porch not 15 feet away, kept the scrub brush moving in exactly the same rhythm, kept her head at exactly the same angle, and felt the words land in her chest like something solid. "My attorney." He'd said it with a flatness and finality that left no room for negotiation and offered no further information, which was, she thought, exactly right. Doyle glanced around the yard, at the bunkhouse, at the porch. His gaze passed over Evelyn, the way gazes pass over furniture, and moved on. "I wasn't aware you had retained counsel." "There are a lot of things about my situation that I expect you're not fully aware of," Silas said. A beat. The 2 large men stood slightly behind Doyle, and to either side, which was a positioning Evelyn recognized, present enough to be felt, not forward enough to be technically threatening. Doyle looked at Silas for a moment with the look of a man recalibrating. "We'll need to do a preliminary inspection of the property," Doyle said. "Standard assessment, per the terms of the agreement." "You're welcome to walk the fence lines," Silas said. "The house and the working structures are off limits until I've spoken with my attorney about the specific scope of your right of access under the contract terms." Another beat. This one slightly longer. "That's an unusual position," Doyle said pleasantly. "It's my ranch," Silas said. "Until the moment it isn't, that's how it's going to be." Doyle smiled. The smile did not involve his eyes at all. "We'll camp out by the eastern water access for tonight then. We have a few days of work to do in the area regardless." He turned back to his horse. Then, as if it were an afterthought, which it very clearly was not, he turned back and said, "We'll need to review the loan documentation. Standard procedure before formal initiation. Perhaps tomorrow morning, in the house?" "I'll let you know," Silas said. Doyle nodded, mounted, rode out with his 2 men toward the eastern fence line without looking back. Silas stood in the yard until they were out of sight. Then he turned and looked at the porch, where Evelyn was wringing out the scrub brush with methodical attention. She looked up at him. He looked back. She gave him the smallest, most controlled nod she possessed, which meant, "You did exactly right." He exhaled. It was not quite relief. Relief wasn't available yet, but it was the exhalation of a man who has held a difficult position and not broken. And that was something. She waited until he went back to the barn, Then she stood up, carried the bucket around to the back of the house, and went directly to the study. She had been prepared for this. Prepared specifically, the night before, on the basis that if Doyle had been in this position 11 times, he knew that documentation was the foundation of everything, and that his first goal on arrival would be to either photograph or physically remove the most important pieces of Silas's legal paper trail before any formal challenge could be mounted. She moved through the study with the quick efficiency of someone who had organized the room and knew exactly where every piece of paper lived. She did not take everything. That would be too obvious. She took the original loan agreement, the acceleration notice from Doyle, 2 letters from Western Continental that predated the notice and contained language about the appraisal clause, and a ledger page that showed the payment history in Silas's own hand. These she folded with the careful precision of someone who has handled documents for 6 years and knows that crease lines matter and paper tears, and she placed them inside the lining of the winter coat hanging in the back of the hallway closet. Not her coat, not Silas's coat, but a heavy wool coat of uncertain ownership that had lived on that hook for what appeared to be at least 2 winters and was unlikely to be investigated by men who were looking for papers in a study. In the study, she left the copies she had made, complete, accurate copies in her own handwriting, which any serious legal examination would reveal as secondary documents, but which would require that serious legal examination to discover, and which would, in the meantime, look like the originals to a man who was moving fast and confident. She was back on the porch with the fresh bucket of water and the scrub brush before Cutter came through the yard at noon. That night, after supper, after the hands retired and Rosa's light went out, after the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds, she knocked on the study door. Silas opened it immediately. He had clearly not been sleeping either. She came in and closed the door and went to the desk and wrote on the notepad without preamble. The original loan documents are in the lining of the old wool coat in the hall closet. If Doyle's men ask to see them tomorrow, show them the copies on the desk. They'll look right. If they take them, it doesn't matter. They're copies. We have the originals. He read it. His jaw tightened slightly. Then, "You expected they'd try to take them." She wrote, "I've been expecting it since the first week. A foreclosure this calculated doesn't leave the borrower access to the documents that could challenge it. Standard procedure would be to retrieve them before any legal action is filed." He stood for a moment with the notepad in his hands. "This is not how I would have thought to handle this," he said, and the way he said it was not criticism. It was the honest acknowledgement of a man realizing, with some complexity of feeling, that the person he'd barely noticed for the first 2 weeks of her presence had been 3 steps ahead of his problem the entire time. She took the notepad back and wrote, "We need to go to Caldwell the day after tomorrow. Early, before Doyle's people can file anything with the county clerk. Giddings has the papers ready. We just need your signature and we file everything simultaneously. The defect challenge, the appraisal clause objection, and the fraud pattern documentation. And if Doyle tries to stop us leaving?" She held his gaze. "He won't know we're going until we're already back." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "I've got a question," he said, "and I'd like an honest answer." He set the notepad down on the desk. "The way you've handled this, the documents, the legal structure, the Caldwell attorney, this isn't something a housekeeper puts together. I need to know who you are." The fireplace behind him gave the only light in the room, and the shadows moved slowly across the walls, and the ranch was quiet outside. And Evelyn Cross stood in the middle of the study of a ranch she had arrived at 6 weeks ago, with a canvas bag and a plan, and now something considerably more complicated. And she thought about what honesty cost and what it was worth. And she made the same kind of decision she had been making since she was 7 years old, learning to read lips in a Denver kitchen. The decision to trust what was in front of her rather than the version of it she'd planned for. She picked up the notepad. "My name is Evelyn Cross. I was a legal secretary for 6 years in Denver. I am not deaf. I have never been deaf. Gerald Pratt knows this. It was an arrangement that benefited him financially. I allowed people to believe I couldn't hear because people talk honestly when they think they're unheard. In 6 weeks, I have heard everything said on this ranch and used it to understand what Emmett Holt is doing to you and how to stop him. I understand if that makes you angry. I thought knowing the whole truth could wait until we had something to fight with. We now have something to fight with." She set the notepad on the desk and turned it to face him and stepped back. He read it. She watched him read it, watched his eyes move through the lines, watched his face do a number of things in sequence. Confusion first, then understanding, then something sharp and complicated that was not precisely anger, but was closely related to it. And then, after a moment that stretched long enough that she began to calculate the distance to the door, something else. Something that settled. He looked up. "You heard everything," he said. Not a question. "In the barn." "Yes," she said. It was the first word she had spoken aloud in his presence, and the effect was, she watched it register on his face, startling in the specific way that a familiar room is startling when you suddenly see it lit differently. "You heard me say—" He stopped. "Yes," she said again quietly. "I heard you." He looked away, looked at the fireplace. Something moved across his face that was private and that she did not press. After a moment he said, still to the fire, "You could have told me sooner." "I could have," she said. "I chose not to because I didn't have enough yet to be useful. I'm sorry for the deception. I'm not sorry for the work." The fire moved. The shadows moved with it. "Shadows?" "Pratt," Silas said finally, and the word had an edge like a freshly honed knife. "He knew about the loan. He delivered you here, knowing." "Yes," she said. "I believe so. I think you were meant to have a housekeeper who couldn't hear anything and wouldn't be a problem while Doyle's people worked through the process. What Pratt didn't know was the arrangement I'd made with him was not the arrangement I intended to keep." Silas turned back from the fire and looked at her, and the look now was different from any look he had given her before. Not the equipment assessment, not the barn vulnerability, not the careful trust of the past 2 weeks. This was a look of someone reassembling their understanding of a situation and finding that the reassembled version is both more complicated and more solid than what they'd had before. "Can we win?" he said. "I believe so," she said. "Giddings believes so. The legal defect is real. The fraud pattern is documented. Holt has done this 11 times without anyone fighting back because no one had the information assembled in time. We have it assembled. We just need to get it in front of a judge before Doyle files his paperwork." A long moment. "Caldwell," Silas said. "Day after tomorrow. Before sunup." "Yes." He nodded once. The nod was decisive in the way that decisions are decisive when they come from somewhere real rather than somewhere calculated. "I'll have the horses ready at 4. She picked up her notepad from the desk. "One more thing," she said. "Whatever happens, however this goes, I need you to know that nothing I've done was for any reason other than—" She stopped because she was not accustomed to saying certain things aloud and found the words resisting. "This ranch should stay yours," she said finally. "That's the whole of it." He looked at her. She walked to the door. "Evelyn," he said, and she stopped with her hand on the doorframe. 4 o'clock, he said. "Don't be late." She almost smiled. She didn't, not quite, but the almost of it was genuine. She went to her room and did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch and thought about 4 o'clock in county clerk offices and the particular look on Harlan Doyle's face when a plan he'd spent years constructing started to come apart. And she thought that tomorrow was going to be the longest day she had experienced in a life that had not been short on long days. Outside, the wind had changed direction. Coming from the north now, carrying the first real edge of winter in it, moving across the flatland and through the dry grass and against the walls of the house that Silas Mercer's father had built with his own hands on land that had cost everything a man could cost and was not, she had decided, going to belong to Emmett Holt. Not while she had anything to say about it. And for the first time in 6 weeks, she had quite a lot to say. They left at 4 o'clock exactly. The ranch was still completely dark when Silas brought the horses around. Not the wagon, which was too slow and too visible, but 2 saddle horses, a gray mare for her and his own bay gelding that he rode with the automatic ease of a man who has spent more hours in a saddle than out of one. She was waiting at the barn door when he arrived, canvas bag over her shoulder, the original loan documents still in their careful fold inside her coat, which she was wearing over 2 layers because the north wind from the previous night had not softened with dawn. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither said anything. They rode out before the first gray light reached the eastern horizon, moving at a steady pace down the ranch road and then onto the main track toward Caldwell, and the cold came at them from the front, and the dark came at them from everywhere else. And the only sounds were the horses and the wind and the distant, indifferent conversation of a landscape that had been doing this, cold and dark and vast, and not particularly concerned with the problems of the people crossing it, for considerably longer than any of those people had been alive. Doyle's camp was visible from the main road as a distant orange point of fire near the eastern water access. She watched it as they rode past its general direction, watched it the way you watch something dangerous that you are deliberately not approaching, and it stayed distant and steady and unaware of them. And then it was behind them and the road opened up and Silas touched the bay into a faster walk. "He'll know soon enough," Silas said, not loudly, just into the space between them, in the way that people on horseback in the dark say things, not requiring response, releasing a thought into the air. "Yes," she said. "How fast can he respond once he knows we've filed?" "His lawyers can file a counterargument within a few days," she said, "but by then the challenge is already on record. The foreclosure process can't proceed while the challenge is under judicial review. That buys us time at minimum. Giddings thinks the argument is strong enough to survive the counter." What does Giddings think Holt will do when he realizes someone's actually pushing back? She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. He'll apply pressure wherever he can. He'll try to find a way to make the case go away before a judge rules on it. He has connections. Giddings was clear about that. But connections are harder to use when there's a documented public record. The fraud pattern is the strongest piece. If a judge sees 11 property transfers following the same mechanism and agrees to look at the pattern as evidence, it becomes something a lot harder to bury, Silas said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily. 11 families, he said, and the flatness in his voice when he said it was not the flatness of someone who didn't feel it. It was the flatness of someone feeling it precisely and choosing where to put it. 11 ranches. That I can document, she said. There may be more. He didn't respond to that. She hadn't expected him to. Some things you receive and sit with and don't try to put words to because words aren't the right container. They rode the rest of the way to Caldwell in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which told her something about what the last 2 weeks had built between them without either of them particularly choosing to build it. Arthur Giddings was waiting. He had clearly been at his office for some time before they arrived. There were 2 lamps lit, a pot of coffee on the small stove in the corner, and the papers laid out on his desk with the organized, deliberate precision of a man who had spent the previous day preparing for exactly this morning. He shook Silas's hand first, then Evelyn's, and then he looked at the two of them together, and something in his expression settled, like a calculation that has finally resolved. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "Miss Cross has explained the substance of what we're filing. I want to walk you through everything before you sign anything, because your signature is what makes this real, and I need you to understand what you're putting your name to." "Then walk me through it," Silas said. Giddings walked him through it. It took 40 minutes, and Silas asked 7 questions, and Giddings answered all 7 completely, and without the faint condescension that lawyers sometimes deploy with clients who don't have legal training, which confirmed Evelyn's assessment of Giddings as a man whose professional ethics were intact, despite the pressures of practicing in a county where Emmett Holt's name carried significant weight. At the end of the 40 minutes, Silas picked up the pen. He held it for a moment over the first document, and she watched his hand, that large, cedar-built hand, steady itself over the paper with the deliberate quality of someone who has already made the decision and is now simply executing it. He signed. He moved to the next document. He signed that too. He signed all 7 documents that Giddings had prepared, moving through them with a calm that she recognized as the particular calm of someone who has been frightened for a long time and has finally found something to do with it. When he was done, he set down the pen and looked at Giddings. "How long before we know?" "The county clerk's office opens at 8, Giddings said. "I'll be there when the doors open. Once it's filed, Doyle's people will be notified as required by procedure. I would expect them to know by noon." He paused. "By tonight, Holt will know." Silas nodded. "Then let's make sure you get there at 8. They waited in Giddings' office while the town of Caldwell came slowly to life around them, a thing Evelyn observed with the particular clarity of someone running on very little sleep and very high alertness, which had the effect of making ordinary details appear in sharp relief. The way everything looks briefly vivid and specific in the moment just before something large and irreversible happens. A dog crossing the street, the sound of a hammer beginning work somewhere 2 blocks over, the dry goods merchant turning his sign from closed to open. At 5 minutes to 8, Giddings put on his coat, gathered the files, shook their hands again, and walked out. They stood in his empty office and listened to his footsteps going down the stairs. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and handed her one without asking if she wanted it. She took it. They stood by the window and watched the street and did not speak, and the silence had in it everything that had been said in the previous hours, and everything that hadn't, and the particular density of a moment that both people in it know is not ordinary. "After this is settled," Silas said, still looking at the street, "I want to ask you something." "Ask it now," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression was careful and direct at the same time, in the way that a man looks when he's decided to say an honest thing and is making sure he says it right. "I want to ask you to stay on, not as a housekeeper, as—" He stopped, and the pause was not evasion but precision. The precision of a man choosing words because the wrong ones would misrepresent something that mattered. "As a partner," he said, "in running the ranch, the legal side, the financial side, the things I—" A brief, self-aware pause. "The things I'm clearly not as equipped for as I thought I was." She looked at him. Outside, a clock somewhere in Caldwell struck 8, the sound traveling clean and clear through the cold morning air. And somewhere across town, Arthur Giddings was walking through the county clerk's office door with 7 signed documents that were about to change the legal landscape of the Mercer Ranch. And if everything held the way she believed it would, a great deal more besides. "Ask me again when it's settled," she said, "and I'll give you a proper answer." Something shifted in his face, the not-quite smile again, and this time it got slightly further than before. "Fair enough," he said. They rode back to the ranch. Doyle's men were still at the eastern water access when they returned, and Doyle himself was visible in the distance, standing near the creek with what appeared to be a surveying instrument, doing the work of a man who is taking careful measurements of something he believes he is about to own. She watched him from the horse for a moment as they came up the ranch road. He did not look up. By noon, he would know. She dismounted at the barn and handed the gray mare to Pete, who had appeared with the automatic helpfulness of a young man who spent a great deal of energy trying to be useful and occasionally succeeded. He took the reins and looked at her, and then at Silas with the uncertain expression of someone who knows something significant has happened and hasn't been told what. "Everything all right?" Pete said. "Getting there," Silas said, and walked toward the house. She followed him, and behind her Pete stood holding 2 horses and looking after them with an expression that suggested he was going to be spending the rest of the morning trying to decide what that meant. Inside, Rosa was in the kitchen. She looked at them both when they came in, at their faces, at the residue of 4 o'clock and 40 miles and 7 signatures and a cup of coffee in a lawyer's office. And she asked nothing at all, which was, Evelyn thought, one of Rosa's greatest qualities. She set food on the table instead, the specific food she set out when she knew someone had been a long time without eating. And she poured coffee without being asked, and she went back to the stove and did not pretend she wasn't listening. "Rosa," Silas said, sitting down and wrapping both hands around the coffee cup, "we filed a legal challenge to the foreclosure this morning. It's on the record now." Rosa did not turn around from the stove, but the set of her shoulders changed, and after a moment she said very quietly, "About time." Silas looked at the table. "You knew things were bad." "I knew things were bad for a year," Rosa said. "I didn't know someone was doing something about it until about 2 weeks ago." She turned then, and her eyes went to Evelyn with a look that contained in equal measure assessment and acknowledgement, and something that was close to gratitude. "When the pantry got organized," Evelyn picked up her coffee cup. "The pantry got organized the first week," she said. Rosa's expression shifted. The slightest of smiles, the kind a woman produces when something has confirmed what she already suspected. "I know," she said. "I mean, when I started watching the pantry get organized and thought, that is a woman who came here to do more than clean." The sound that came from Silas was a short, quiet laugh. A real one, the first she'd heard from him. It lasted only a moment, but it changed the quality of the room briefly and entirely, the way a single note can change the character of a piece of music. Doyle arrived at the ranch house at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He did not ride up slowly this time. He came at a pace that communicated information, dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, and crossed the yard with his 2 large men behind him and the bearing of someone who has received news that has fundamentally altered his posture toward the day. The pleasant, organized authority of his morning manner was still present, but its surface had thinned, and underneath it something harder and less managed was visible. Silas was on the porch. Evelyn was in the doorway of the house, slightly behind and to his left. "You filed," Doyle said. It was not a greeting. "I did," Silas said. "Mr. Mercer." Doyle stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up, and the look was a new one. Still controlled, still professional in the surface architecture of it, but carrying something underneath that was closer to personal than anything she had seen from him before. Men like Doyle were not accustomed to being outmaneuvered, and the particular discomfort of being outmaneuvered by someone they'd dismissed lived in his face despite his best efforts. "This challenge has no merit. The loan documents are ironclad. Whatever attorney you've engaged has filed a specific statutory challenge to the acceleration clause on the basis of the 1887 agricultural lending provisions," Silas said, "which you are welcome to review at the county clerk's office, where it is now part of the public record." A pause. Doyle's eyes moved briefly to the doorway behind Silas. They passed over Evelyn. They moved back to Silas. "The clause is standard," he said. "The clause does not include a cure period," Silas said, "which is not standard, which your lawyers are, I imagine, explaining to you at some length right about now." Something moved across Doyle's face. It was the movement of a man whose legal team has already had this conversation with him this morning and has not brought him entirely comfortable news. He controlled it quickly and thoroughly, but she had been watching faces for a long time, and she had seen it. "There is also," Silas continued, with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who has practiced saying a thing and is now saying it, "a supplemental filing documenting a pattern of fraudulent loan structuring across 11 previous properties in 3 counties, all connected to the same lending entity. That filing requests that the court review the entire body of Western Continental's lending practices in this region as material evidence of intent." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences of the morning. It was the silence of a plan encountering an obstacle it had not included in its calculations, and it had a sound to it, or rather, the specific absence of sound to it, that she recognized as the sound of something beginning to come apart at a joint. Doyle looked at Silas for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. This time, he did not look past her. He looked at her directly, with a slow, evaluating attention that was nothing like the furniture glance of that morning, and she understood that someone, Pratt, most likely, had already made a phone call, and that Doyle now knew, or suspected, and was looking at her with the specific expression of a man who is recalculating how a piece that appeared insignificant has been functioning as the most important piece on the board. "Miss Cross," he said. "Mr. Doyle," she said. His jaw tightened exactly once. "You've been busy." "I've been working," she said. "That's what I was here to do." He held her gaze for a moment that was perhaps a second longer than necessary. Then he turned back to Silas. "This is not over." "I know that," Silas said. "But the next part of it happens in a courtroom, in front of a judge, with the full record on the table." He paused. "Including the record of the 11 ranches before mine." Doyle said nothing. He turned, walked back to his horse, and mounted with the controlled, deliberate movements of a man who is very angry and is not going to let anyone see how angry. His 2 men followed. They rode out through the ranch gate and down the road and did not look back. And Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched them go with the flat, steady attention she had turned on everything at this ranch since the first morning. And she did not allow herself to feel, quite yet, the thing that was building in her chest. Not yet. There was still a court date to survive. Behind her, she heard Pete's voice from somewhere near the bunkhouse. He had apparently been watching from a safe distance, say to Dutch, in an odd, slightly bewildered tone, "What just happened?" Dutch's response came after a pause, in the dry, compressed manner that characterized everything Dutch said. "Woman happened," he said. "Pay attention. Might learn something." Silas turned from watching the road and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the expression on his face was something she did not immediately have a name for and then did. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying something very heavy and has just, for the first time, been allowed to set it down long enough to breathe. "That was the easy part, wasn't it?" he said. It was not quite a question. "The easy part was last night," she said. "This was the middle part. The court is the hard part." He nodded, looked at the road where Doyle had gone, looked back at her. "You ready for the hard part?" She thought about the notebook under the loose floorboard with 49 days of work in it. She thought about Giddings's careful 4-page legal opinion. She thought about 11 families who had not had the information in time and one ranch that did. She thought about the particular sound of Rosa's voice saying about time, and Pete's voice saying what just happened, and Dutch's voice saying woman happened, and Silas's voice in the barn saying I'm going to lose this place in the tone of a final confession. And she thought about her mother reading lips across a Denver kitchen and a 7-year-old girl learning that silence is not the same as weakness, that patience is not the same as passivity, that invisible is not the same as powerless. Yes, she said. They went inside. Rosa had kept the food warm. That evening, for the first time since Evelyn had arrived at the Mercer Ranch, the kitchen table held all of them. Silas at one end, Rosa across from Evelyn, Pete beside Dutch, and the meal was the same food Rosa always made, but the quality of the room around it was different. Something had broken open in the day and let different air in, and the conversation moved differently, and the silences felt different. And even Dutch, who appeared constitutionally opposed to anything resembling warmth, said something to Evelyn directly and looked at her while he said it, which from Dutch was the equivalent of a standing ovation. What he said was, "Good work." 2 words, flat and unadorned and entirely genuine. She accepted them the same way. After supper, after Pete and Dutch went to the bunkhouse and Rosa retired and the kitchen was quiet and clean, Evelyn sat at the table alone for a while. She did not go immediately to her room. She sat with the lamp burning low and listened to the windmill turning outside and the horses shifting in the barn and the far sounds of the night desert doing its patient, enormous work. And she allowed herself, quietly and without drama, to feel the thing she had been holding off all day. Not victory. It was too early for that, and she knew the distance still between here and a judge's ruling. Not relief. There was too much still in motion. Something smaller and more precise than either. Something closer to the particular sensation of having done a right thing at cost, and found that the cost was, provisionally, worth it. The lamp burned. The windmill turned. In 2 days they would know when the court date was set. And however many days after that, they would stand in front of a judge with everything they had assembled, and the weight of it would either hold or it would not. And she had done everything she could do to ensure that it held, and now the work was of a different kind. The work of waiting, of maintaining, of holding the line, while the legal machinery moved at its own pace toward whatever it was going to become. She extinguished the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark. Then she went to her room, retrieved the notebook from its place under the loose board, and opened it to a fresh page. She had things to prepare for the court. She always had things to prepare. She picked up her pen, and in the dark ranch that was still hers to protect, she began to write. The court date came on a Thursday, 17 days after the filing. 17 days that moved with the dense, pressurized quality that had characterized everything since Doyle's men had ridden onto the ranch property. Each one full of preparation, of document review, of evenings in the study with Giddings's papers spread across the desk, and Silas reading through them with the focused, increasingly competent attention of a man who had decided that understanding his own situation was no longer optional. He asked better questions now than he had in the beginning. He retained what he learned. He had, she observed, the particular quality of intelligence that thrives under pressure rather than collapsing beneath it, and she thought that if he had been born into different circumstances, if someone had put the right books in front of him at the right age, he would have made an extraordinary lawyer. He was not bad as a rancher either. The ride into Caldwell for the court date was different from the 4 o'clock in the dark ride of 17 days ago. They left at a civilized hour, with gray morning light already establishing itself over the flat land. And they did not go on horseback but in the wagon, because Giddings had advised that arriving in a wagon was appropriate for the tone of the proceedings, and arriving on horseback communicated a combativeness they did not need to communicate. Their argument, Giddings had said in his dry, precise way, was going to speak for itself. They didn't need their transportation to do it first. Rosa had pressed Silas's good shirt the night before without being asked. Pete had cleaned the wagon. Dutch had not done anything visible or demonstrative, but he had been at the barn at 5 in the morning checking the horses' shoes, which was Dutch's way of participating in something he considered important without submitting to the indignity of appearing to care. Evelyn wore the coat from the hallway closet, not as concealment this time. She had retrieved the original documents from its lining days ago and transferred them to Giddings' safekeeping. She wore the coat because it was warm and the morning was cold, and there was something that felt right about wearing the thing that had hidden the evidence, now that the evidence no longer needed to be hidden, Silas noticed. She could tell by the slight pause when he handed her up into the wagon seat, the fractional recognition in his eyes. He said nothing about it. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, and they moved out through the ranch gate in the pale morning light, and behind them the ranch sat solid and quiet against the land, and she did not look back at it, but she was aware of it, the way you are aware of something you are fighting for. Giddings was at the courthouse steps when they arrived, which was a small, solid sandstone building at the end of Caldwell's main street that had the permanent, slightly self-important air of a building that considers itself the most serious structure in its vicinity. He shook their hands and walked them through what to expect and reviewed the order of presentation one final time, speaking quickly and quietly with the efficiency of a man who has done this many times and knows that last-minute information is best delivered in compressed form. Holt's attorneys are already inside, he said. 3 of them, from the Capitol. Expensive suits. He said it without apparent concern, which was either genuine composure or professional theater, and she chose to believe it was genuine. That tells you they take the filing seriously. If they didn't, they'd have sent 1 man from the county. 3 lawyers, Silas said. 3 lawyers means they're worried, Giddings said. Worried is good. Worried men make mistakes. He looked at them both. Let me speak. If either of you is asked a direct question by the judge, answer directly and briefly. Don't elaborate, don't qualify. Just answer what was asked. They went inside. The courtroom was not large. Wood floors, high ceiling, 2 long benches for spectators that held perhaps a dozen people. She recognized the faces of 2 men from neighboring ranches and understood that word had traveled, as word does in small counties, and that what happened in this room today was going to be known by nightfall in every house within 30 miles. Holt's 3 attorneys were at the table to the right, young, well-dressed, carrying the specific confidence of men who have significant resources backing them and know it. They arranged their papers with practiced ease and spoke to each other in low voices and did not look at Silas and Evelyn when they came in, which was itself a calculated communication. She did not look at them either. She sat beside Giddings at the left table and placed her hands flat on the surface and breathed carefully and looked at the empty bench where the judge would sit and thought about everything in the notebook under the loose floorboard. 49 days of accumulated knowledge reduced to the 7 documents now in Giddings' file, each one a precise piece of the argument they were about to make. Holt himself was not present. She had not expected him to be, and his absence confirmed something she had understood about him from the pattern of how he operated. Emmett Holt did not put himself in rooms where things could go wrong. He sent representatives, maintained distance, kept his hands clean in the specific way that careful, patient predators keep their hands clean. He had built an empire on the principle that he never needed to be the one holding the knife. Today was possibly the first day in 15 years that his distance was not going to protect him. Judge Aldous Crane came in at 9 o'clock sharp, and the room stood and sat, and he settled himself at the bench with the unhurried, economical movements of a man in his mid-60s who has been doing this long enough to have shed every unnecessary element of performance and kept only what was actually useful. He had a wide, angular face and pale eyes that moved across the courtroom with the alert, assessing quality of someone who makes judgments for a living and has learned to make them quickly without making them carelessly. He looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at the left table. He looked at the right table. He said, "Mr. Giddings, you filed this challenge. Present your argument." Giddings stood. He was not a theatrical man. He did not have the capital city polish of Holt's 3 attorneys, or the booming, persuasive voice of the kind of lawyer that fills large rooms. What he had was precision. The precision of a man who had spent 30 years in a small county practicing law that mattered to real people, and had learned that a clear, well-structured argument presented without ornamentation is, in a well-run courtroom, more persuasive than any amount of performance. He presented the acceleration clause defect first. He cited the statutory language of the 1887 provisions with the specific section numbers. He presented the original loan document and pointed to the exact location of the defect, the absence of cure language, and then placed beside it 3 other Western Continental loan agreements from 3 previous foreclosures in the county, all of which contained the same defect, all of which had resulted in property transfers that had never been legally challenged, and all of which were now, in light of the statutory question being raised, of potentially significant interest to the court. He was concise. He was precise. He was, she thought, watching his back as he spoke, very good. Holt's lead attorney, a tall, gray-templed man named Rourke, who had the confidence of someone who charges more per hour than most people in this county earn in a week, objected 3 times in the first 15 minutes. Judge Crane overruled him twice and sustained him once, and the one sustain was on a procedural point that cost Giddings nothing material, and the 2 overrules cost Rourke something she could see in the very slight tightening around his eyes. Then Giddings presented the fraud pattern documentation. He presented it the way she had organized it for him, chronologically, methodically, each of the 11 previous acquisitions laid out with the dates and the loan structures and the defect in each, and the name Western Continental appearing in every single one, and the name Emmett Holt appearing in the property records after every single transfer. He presented the Nevada corporate documentation, showing Western Continental's structure and its connection to Holt's other business interests. He presented the letter from a retired county assessor in the neighboring county, a letter she had written to the man and received back carefully during the 17 days of preparation, describing having been approached by a Western Continental representative and asked to provide a below-market assessment of a specific property that was subsequently foreclosed. He presented it all, and the room was very quiet while he did, and Judge Crane listened with the complete focused attention of a man who is hearing something he considers important and has no intention of missing a word of it. When Giddings sat down, Rourke stood up. He was good. She gave him that without reservation. He was very good, and the 3 of them together were a formidable unit, and for the next 40 minutes they mounted a counter-argument that was technically polished and legally sophisticated and addressed the statutory question with genuine competence. They argued that the cure language, while not explicit, was implied by the structure of the notice period. They argued that the fraud pattern documentation was circumstantial, and that the prior property transfers were separate matters not relevant to the current proceeding. They argued that Western Continental was a legally registered entity operating within the bounds of territorial law. They were persuasive in the way that expensive lawyers are persuasive, smoothly, confidently, with the underlying suggestion that the weight of resources and professional standing behind their position was itself a kind of argument. Judge Crane listened to all of it. He asked Rourke 2 questions. He asked Giddings 1 question. He looked at the documents again. He looked at the courtroom. Then he said, "I'm going to take 30 minutes." He stood. The room stood. He went through the door behind the bench. 30 minutes. She sat very still at the left table and did not look at Holt's attorneys, and did not look at the spectator benches, and did not look at Silas, who was sitting beside her with his hands folded on the table and his jaw set and his eyes on the middle distance with the particular fixed quality of someone who is managing something very large by focusing on something very small. Giddings was making notes in a small pad. His hand was steady. The room was very quiet. Someone in the spectator benches coughed. The sound was enormous in the silence. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the 1887 agricultural lending provisions, Section 4, subsection C, which she had read so many times she could reproduce it word for word in either direction. She thought about the specific absence of the word cure in the loan agreement, which she had verified on 4 separate readings, 3 of them alone, and 1 with Silas beside her checking each line as she pointed to it. She thought about the retired county assessor's letter and whether its inclusion had been exactly right, or whether it had been 1 document too many, 1 piece of evidence that tilted from documentation toward desperation. And she concluded, as she had each time she'd had this thought in the 17 days of preparation, that it was right. That a judge looking at a pattern needed the human testimony to understand that the pattern was not coincidence. She thought about all of it and could not find the flaw she was afraid of. She had done the work. Whatever happened in the next 30 minutes was what happened. Silas's hand moved on the table and covered hers for a moment, briefly, without looking at her, the gesture of a man offering something he has and does not know how to offer more eloquently. She did not move her hand. After a moment, his moved back. At the 28-minute mark, the door behind the bench opened and Judge Crane came back through it, and the room rose and settled, and he sat. He looked at his papers for a moment. Then he looked up. "The statutory requirement is clear," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who has made a decision and is now delivering it rather than building to it. The 1887 agricultural lending provisions require explicit cure language in any acceleration clause in a secured agricultural lending agreement. The loan document in question does not contain that language. The absence is not a technicality, it is the law. The foreclosure proceeding as initiated is therefore structurally invalid and cannot proceed under the current contract terms. Giddings' pen stopped moving. Rourke's expression did not change, but something behind it did. Furthermore, Judge Crane continued, and the word landed in the room with the particular weight of a word that is doing real work. The pattern of lending documented in the supplemental filing raises questions of sufficient seriousness that I am referring the full body of Western Continental's lending practices in this territory to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review. I am also noting for the record that any future attempt to reinitiate foreclosure proceedings on the Mercer property will require a new and legally compliant loan agreement bearing the borrower's signature, which the borrower is under no legal obligation to provide. He set down his papers. "The challenge is upheld," he said. "This proceeding is dismissed." The room was completely silent for one full second. Then it was not. She did not move. She sat at the table while the room came alive around her, and Giddings turned to Silas with his hand extended, and Silas took it, and somewhere in the spectator benches someone said something that set off a low, layered murmur, and she sat with her hands flat on the table and felt the things she had been holding off since the morning of the filing move through her in a slow, comprehensive wave. Not triumph, which would have been too loud, but something quieter and more complete. It was over. The ranch was Silas's. Holt's 3 attorneys were gathering their papers with the organized, expressionless efficiency of professionals who lose occasionally and know how to do it without spectacle. Rourke looked at her once, across the room, as he was closing his case file, and the look was the particular look of a man who has understood precisely what happened to him and by whom, and she met it without expression, and he looked away first. The ride back to the ranch was different from every ride that had preceded it. Giddings rode with them as far as the edge of town, talking through the implications. The Attorney General referral was significant, he said. If the review proceeded seriously, which he believed it would given the quality of the documentation they'd provided, the pattern of 11 previous acquisitions would become a matter of public legal record, which would open the door for the families who had lost those properties to mount their own challenges. Evelyn listened to this and said, "I can provide the documentation I assembled to any attorney representing those families." Giddings looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I rather thought you'd say that." He left them at the edge of town with a handshake and a look that communicated more than the handshake, and they drove the rest of the way in the wagon with the cold air moving over the flat land and the sky doing the deep, transparent blue that it only achieved in the very late fall, when everything unnecessary had been stripped away, and what remained was the pure, essential version of the landscape. "You know what I keep thinking about," Silas said, after a long while. "What?" "The day you arrived," he said. "Pratt talking about you like you weren't sitting right there. The hands." He paused. "Me." She looked at the road ahead of them. "You were distracted," she said. "You had reasons." "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. "You were fighting something you couldn't see clearly. People fight badly when they can't see clearly." He was quiet for a moment. "You could see clearly." "I had the advantage of no one looking at me," she said. "People show you everything when they think you can't see." The wagon moved through the familiar landscape. The flat stretches, the distant line of hills to the north, the particular quality of the light at this hour on this land that she had come to recognize as specific and unrepeatable. The way all light is specific and unrepeatable if you pay attention long enough. She had been paying attention for 66 days now. She knew this land in the way you know something you have watched carefully and fought for. The ranch came into view from the top of the low rise that preceded it, and she saw it the way she had seen it on the first morning, as a whole, as a thing with a specific character and weight. Except that what she saw now was different from what she had seen then. What she saw then was a ranch that was failing. What she saw now was a ranch that had survived, which was not the same thing as a ranch that was saved, because survival required ongoing work, but it was the necessary precondition for everything else. Pete saw them coming from the barn and shouted something back toward the bunkhouse, and by the time they came through the gate, both Pete and Dutch were in the yard, and Rosa was visible in the kitchen doorway. And the particular tableau of it, these people who had gone about their ordinary work for 66 days while something they didn't fully understand was happening around and above them, had a quality that she did not have a prepared response to. Silas climbed down from the wagon and looked at them. "It's done," he said. "Judge dismissed the foreclosure. Ranch stays ours." Pete made a sound that was almost a word, and then abandoned the attempt at language and just made the sound again, louder. Dutch did not make any sound, but he took his hat off, which was the Dutch equivalent of a full emotional response. Rosa stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands in her apron and looked at Silas and then at Evelyn and nodded once. And the nod contained everything that Rosa's nods contained: complete understanding, complete acknowledgement, everything that needed to be said delivered in the single downward motion of a head. Cutter appeared from the far side of the bunkhouse, catching the energy of the yard before he'd been told the news, and looked at the scene with the slightly wrong-footed expression of a man who is encountering a moment he doesn't yet have the context for. Pete told him. The expression changed. He looked at Evelyn. There was a pause that had in it, she thought, a fair amount of work being done. The particular interior work of a man reviewing certain prior behaviors in light of current information and arriving at conclusions about those behaviors that were not flattering. "Ma'am," he said finally, and the word carried an entire conversation's worth of reorientation in its 2 syllables. "I owe you an apology. More than one, probably." "Probably," she agreed, "but today's a good day. We'll leave it there." He nodded, looked at his boots, looked back up. "Yes, ma'am." That evening, the kitchen table held all of them again, as it had in the days after Doyle's departure, except that the quality of the gathering was different now, settled in a way it had not been before. The specific settledness that comes when something uncertain has resolved, and the people who lived through the uncertainty can finally breathe at full capacity. Rosa cooked more than usual, and nobody commented on it because it was understood. Pete talked too much, also understood. Dutch ate everything on his plate twice, which was the most demonstrative thing she had ever seen Dutch do. Silas sat at the end of the table and watched his people and did not say very much, but the silence he maintained was a different kind of silence than any he'd carried in the 66 days she had known him. Lighter, she thought, like something put down. After supper, after the hands went to the bunkhouse, and Rosa retired and the kitchen had been cleaned with the comfortable automaticity of a task done so many times it required no thought, Silas came back to the kitchen where she was making the final notes in her notebook, documenting the day's events, the judge's exact language, the details of the referral, the things that would matter later for the other families, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in and sitting across from her. She finished the line she was writing and looked up. "I asked you something in Giddings' office," he said. "You did. You said to ask you again when it was settled." She set down her pen. "I remember." He looked at her across the kitchen table, the same table she had wiped down on her 3rd day at this ranch, while Cutter said careless things 3 feet away, and Dutch said something true without meaning to, and Pete was young and didn't know it, the table around which this ranch's life had moved for however many years before she arrived and would continue to move for however many years after. And he said, "I'm asking again." She looked back at him. The lamp was burning low between them, and the windmill was turning outside, and somewhere in the distance the creek that ran through the eastern boundary of the Mercer Ranch, the creek that Emmett Holt had wanted, the water that was the whole point of everything, the thing that made this land valuable beyond what land usually is, moved in the dark over its stones with the particular sound of water that has been moving over those stones for a very long time, and intends to keep doing so. She had been 31 years old when she arrived. She would be 32 in the spring. She had a canvas bag, a notebook full of careful observations, 6 years of legal training, a mother's lesson in practical knowledge, and the specific understanding that silence, chosen deliberately, is one of the most powerful things a person can carry, and that knowing when to stop being silent is equally important. "What does partnership mean exactly?" she said, in practical terms. "I want to understand what I'm agreeing to before I agree to it." Something in his face relaxed. The very specific relaxation of a man who has been bracing for a different answer. "It means your name goes on the operational decisions, the financial records, the legal matters, obviously." He paused. "The water rights documentation, Once Giddings files the formal protection. Your name beside mine on all of it. Equal standing, she said. Equal standing, he confirmed. It was not a question and not quite an offer. It was a statement of what was true, delivered as such. She picked up her pen, looked at it, set it down again. There's something you should know, she said, about why I took Pratt's arrangement in the first place. I wasn't desperate. Not exactly. I was looking for something to be useful for, something that needed the specific things I knew how to do. I'd been in jobs that needed pieces of me and discarded the rest, and I was... She stopped. Found the right word. Tired of being partial. He listened to this without moving. This place needed all of it, she said. Everything I had. And I gave it everything I had. So when you ask me about partnership, what I need you to understand is that I'm not agreeing to be useful in a limited way. I'm not agreeing to be the legal department and leave the rest alone. If I stay in full. I know that, he said. I'm counting on it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then yes, she said. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man receiving something he had worked toward and was not going to treat casually. He stood up. He extended his hand across the table. She looked at the hand. She shook it. His grip was what she had come to expect from those cedar-built hands, firm and direct and entirely without performance, the handshake of a man who means what he does with his body. She released it, and he released it, and he walked to the kitchen door and stopped. Evelyn, he said. She looked up from her notebook. Thank you, he said, for all of it, the whole 66 days. She had counted them too. She thought about saying so. She thought about saying several other things, about her mother, about Denver, about the specific quality of silence that is chosen rather than imposed, about the notebook under the loose board, and the particular satisfaction of watching a plan that you built alone in the dark turn out to hold weight in the light. She thought about all of it and said, "Get some sleep. There's work tomorrow." He almost smiled. All the way this time. He went to bed. She wrote for another hour, completing the documentation of the day with the same meticulous care she had brought to every entry since the first night. And then she closed the notebook and sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen with the lamp burning and the windmill turning and the creek moving in the dark. And she thought that there was a very specific kind of freedom in being fully known by a place, in having given everything you had to something and found that it was enough, that the something held, that the work was real. She extinguished the lamp. In the dark, the ranch breathed around her, the sounds of horses and wind and water, and the particular night sounds of a working place that is alive and intends to remain so. She went to bed. In the morning, there was work. There was always, she thought, work, and for the first time in a very long time, that was not a weight she carried. It was a reason to get up. She closed her eyes, and the windmill turned, and the Mercer Ranch held itself against the dark and the cold, and the vast, indifferent night, solid on the land where it had always stood, where it was going to keep standing. And in the smallest room in the house, the woman who had saved it slept without dreaming, because she had already done everything necessary, and the rest was morning.